at Commercial Type, and I'd like to thank everybody, Anuthan for bringing me here, everybody from Kotz and DeMock for putting this great conference on. And so I'm going to be talking about ahistoric reading, which may be a little bit confusing. Basically, I've been working at Commercial Type for 5 years, and 3 of those years I've been working on one project. It was a custom project, but it kind of has a different process than what we're used to. Most of what we've done, kind of like, or most of the typefaces we've done, kind of have a place in history. They start, so like Paul's Brunel is based on history and stays pretty close to it. His Chiswick also comes from history. And other typefaces like Christian's Graphik, Duplicate, Miguel's Canela, and my typeface Robinson, they all have historical starting points, but kind of veer off in different places sometimes. And so this project I've been working on called Roboto Serif actually kind of didn't start that way. It was originally commissioned by Rob Giampetro when he was still working at Google. And the impetus for this project was they wanted a new reading typeface for the screen. And it had to be, comfortable for that, but also very functional and utilitarian. And so it was kind of an interesting project that they came to us with, and we were kind of thinking, okay, this is very interesting. Maybe we should approach this in a different way and not purely just go from history. But I feel like I should give you a little bit of history because, So everybody knows this typeface, I'm sure. You've all seen it on pretty much every screen you've ever looked at. And it's designed by Matthew Carter, of course, released in '96, and pretty much comes standard on every computer. And I think it being so widely used is just a testament to how good of a typeface it is. But what's really interesting to me about it is that it was actually designed to bridge the gap between reading on paper to reading on screen, back when reading on screen was such a new thing. Like if many of you can remember the '90s, we didn't have smartphones, we didn't have a lot of computers. So reading on screen was such a new idea that this typeface was helping bridge that gap to reading on screen. And also, I think it's important to note that it's still around a lot. You can see it on Wikipedia, Girlboss, or somewhere else. And even New York Times was using it on their website, maybe until 2016. And so what I mean by it bridging the gap between paper and screen is kind of more about like where it comes from in history. It kind of uses these hallmarks of newspaper typefaces, as you can see here. And the hallmarks I'm talking about are its large X height, lower contrast, and simplified details. So these things kind of like subconsciously or consciously let the reader know that they're reading something that's a newspaper typeface. These things kind of just become accepted by us after seeing it so often. And all of those kind of features kind of help typefaces look good on paper, but also on screen. And so here you can see George's closer relationship to the newspaper typeface Corona, and also Miller Text, just for comparison. So you can see that it uses the credibility of history to kind of leverage this new medium that people are going to be using. And so I thought that was a very interesting way to approach history and approach a new typeface for something that people are not used to at all. But after 25 years of people reading this on screen and just reading on screens in general, I think we can kind of move on and we can shed historical notions. But then, it makes me think like, okay, well, if we're doing that, what's going to make a new reading experience that's comfortable, like that we can kind of try new things. And so this whole project was kind of about designing a process more than kind of looking at a historical source and just kind of building on it. We actually just kind of thought it'd be a cool thing to try to just like take what makes a serif typeface and kind of explode it out into its different elemental parts. And so that's what we were kind of looking at. We were thinking about, okay, we could separate out, the rhythm of the letter forms, the vertical height of letter forms, serifs, and terminals. So at first we were trying different rhythms. which I think was really interesting because, at the top one, the letter forms are more similar in character width, and the bottom, they're a little bit more varied, which is kind of more like book typefaces, while the top is more like newspaper typefaces. And as we were working on this, we were kind of asking ourselves, okay, the more varied one that's more like book typefaces kind of feels more comfortable, but it feels, a little bit too old. And the ones that are too even kind of feel too monotonous. And it kind of was trying to find the right in-between place of where this typeface felt comfortable on screen. And we ended up somewhere kind of in the middle. It wasn't exactly one or the other, but it kind of skewed more towards the bookish one. And so the vertical proportions of the typeface were really important because it has to relate to Roboto Sans in a meaningful way. It is Roboto Serif after all, and it has to work well with that in any kind of case where Roboto Sans shows up. And so from the outset, we were just always testing it against Roboto Sans, and we actually made the cap height line up as well as the X height. We just thought it kind of made sense. Since they should work together, they should kind of share these things. It's not just like we're taking the forms of Roboto Sans and adding serifs. We kind of made it more of a distant cousin to kind of fill out the whole family and add a little bit of sophistication and flexibility. But if you notice, the X heights actually don't match up perfectly, and that was an intentional thing because the serifs kind of added too much horizontality. It reinforced that. So it actually made the serif typeface look a lot bigger when it was set next to the sans. And so we would test that against the Roboto Sans in pages like this. And so as we were doing this, we kind of noticed, okay, mathematically, when they're the same height, it just doesn't work. It doesn't really make sense. So we kind of had to do steps in between and then test them to see what felt more comfortable. And so the serifs were another interesting to play around with. In my head, when I was designing this, I was kind of like, oh yeah, a typeface for the screen. I should probably just make really flat, slabby serifs that's going to render really well. But actually, in practice, started to kind of feel more cold and digital, and just kind of didn't feel comfortable, to me at least. And so I was testing out all these other different serif shapes, and we were interpolating between these to kind of find what felt most comfortable. And you can kind of see them more in isolation here. And where we ended up was kind of somewhere, again, in between two things, because we found that having something a little bit more crisp on the interior serifs felt more comfortable, but also a little bit more clear and readable. But it needed a little bit more bracketing on the outside, just so it didn't feel too overly digital and cold in long pages of text. And you can kind of see this again here in words, where the top one is it's very much maybe something you would not want to read a lot of text in. And the bottom gets maybe a little bit too murky. There's a little bit too much swoopy serifs going on, and it becomes a little bit distracting. So we kind of ended up somewhere in between the bottom two. And the terminals. This was a fun thing where I was just kind of trying to draw any terminal shape I could with the different character widths and different contrasts, and I came up with all these weird ideas. But then, after a while, we kind of were thinking this is kind of getting out of hand, and maybe we're asking ourselves too many existential questions, like what is a ball terminal, really? And this kind of goes back to our idea of stripping out nuance in the typeface. We kind of wanted something to sit back and that you could just read and not really notice. So having something like this kind of becomes too characteristic of a typeface. You kind of notice them. And so we thought, okay, maybe the ball should be blocks, just these square things, so it could feel atmosphere agnostic and feel comfortable at the same time reading long pages of text on screen. And also, a square just renders better on screen, too, than circles, so it just kind of helps that works. What helps, too, is that it being a square, it could be very flexible across these different widths, the optical sizes, and everything. It wasn't something that we had to redesign, and rethink at every step of the process. And so a lot of how I was proofing this typeface to check for errors was these long pages of kind of text like this. And after a while, I felt like this is not really, helping me get anywhere. Like I started noticing certain things. Yeah, I'm like used to checking this stuff and seeing it in isolation. But really what helped the project along was actually setting it as my default text typeface. And this is when I was like, I would just open up an article, try to read it, and then I would be like, oh, you know what? Actually, these quotes are like really big. I'm like starting to notice them. I can't really read this article. And so this is where I kind of like really started to like, fine tune a lot of things, which was interesting. And so this is actually a proof that we would send to Google for them to kind of like sign off or make any comments about everything. And so it is going to be a variable typeface. It's going to be kind of big. It's going to have a lot of optical sizes, weights, widths, all of that. So this is like the full weight range in the text family. And again, yeah, it started out as just a text family and then quickly became like, okay, maybe we need a display, maybe we need a micro size, and then maybe we need like widths for every single one of those. So it's kind of grown and blown out to be this huge family. But luckily, I'm not alone in designing it all, so it's kind of nice to have these people help out. And so yeah, it's a variable typeface that's coming soon. It's been an interesting project to work on because there's a lot of ideas that we were testing out early on that Google actually didn't really go for. And kind of thankfully, I got to use some of those for a personal project I've been working on that I've been calling Terza. And so while we were making or designing Roboto Serif, we had this idea that it'd be interesting to have a typeface that's kind of based on the different interactions a person has with text. So there's, immersive reading is one kind of interaction you would have. Composing text is like another one that you would have where you're kind of creating and writing things. Another one is like interacting with raw data or annotations. And so we thought it'd be interesting to create a type family of subfamilies that was based on those three ideas. So you have something that's purely for reading long pages of text, something that's kind of more in between, that's more for writing stuff, and it's kind of like more spread out. You kind of notice individual characters while you're typing and kind of see if you're misspelling things. And then something that's for raw data and annotations. And what I found is that it actually created these really interesting 3 different textures that I feel like are pretty different from each other. And I was like, okay, this is a cool idea. I really like this. I want to go further with it. So I gave it to some friends, but they kind of just used it as something different. So this is actually the author family used for a magazine called Document Journal. But what was kind of cool is that it gave it this unvarnished immediacy to like a special section of interviews. And I kind of never thought I would see this typeface used in this way, but it was interesting to see it in a new life in somebody else's eyes. And then the reader and the typewriter were used for the Brooklyn Rail. And they used it a lot in a special booklet of essays by the author Nora Khan. And she writes a lot about like criticism on emerging issues with digital visual culture. So it's kind of cool to have this like idea that I had with digital interactions with text become, something for somebody who writes about that kind of stuff. And then the typewriter that I had created actually got used in a zine that was, it's kind of a funny zine. It's organized by Shauna Buckley and Simon Sweeney, and they pretty much asked like their favorite designers to come up with fake video games and then draw the logos for it. And so they asked to use my typewriter typeface throughout the whole thing. And they even like used it to make some really cool ASCII art, which I thought was cool. And so yeah, it was kind of interesting to work on a typeface and then kind of get this whole other idea out of it. And yeah, thanks.